Welcome back to our study. We're going to continue our study by looking at the character of Caiaphas. Remember what we're doing. We're looking at these characters in the gospel through the lens of Philippians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. And we want to ask some questions about their motivations. What caused them to do what they did in the gospel story as they stood in opposition of Jesus? As we do look at the characters, we want to focus on the character of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest from 18 to 37 AD. This is overlapping with the ministry of Jesus. One of the things we know about Caiaphas, who is the high priest, is he is really the high priest under Roman occupation. He is the Roman high priest. In fact, his father-in-law, Annas, is still alive. If it was just Jewish law or Jewish custom, Annas would be the high priest. After all, once you have that role, you have it for life. But in a show of force, the Romans reserved the right every year to approve their high priest. Now, the political maneuvering here is interesting because Annas actually has multiple sons, as many as 5 sons, and Caiaphas, as his son-in-law, act out this annual role of high priest. And you can see from the date, Caiaphas now has been the high priest for a good long time. If our dating of Jesus' trial is 33 AD, he's been the high priest for a good time. And as we come to the story today, we want to ask some questions about his motivations. What caused Caiaphas to live in opposition to Jesus as an enemy of the cross? Remember what Paul says in Philippians 3? He says, what makes people walk as an enemy of the cross of Christ is a few attributes. He says, number one, their end is destruction, but it's because their God is their belly. Their glory is their shame. Their mind is on earthly things. And what we want to do is we want to ask through that lens of those attributes, what is it about Caiaphas that caused him to live in such a way that is the opposite of the walk of Jesus? What we'll discover is that Caiaphas very much is motivated by his position or his desire for his position, and all of the things that come with that, whether that be comfort or money or power or influence. Caiaphas is motivated by his desire for this religious position that he has. And we'll see that play out not only in the text, but also in the history of his position. When it comes to this dynamic, we want to pay attention to the fact that Caiaphas is seen early on when it comes to the ministry of Jesus. In fact, even before then, in the ministry of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 3. Luke mentions that John the Baptist comes on the scene during the priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. And so what do we know about Caiaphas? Well, we know that he's been around for Jesus' entire ministry. And Jesus, in many ways, poses a threat to Caiaphas. Let me just expound on that for a moment. When Jesus steps onto the scene in the book of John, Jesus, John says, comes into the temple and he cleanses the temple. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, at the end of Jesus' ministry, I believe there are 2, Jesus again rides in to Jerusalem as the Messiah, and as he rides in, he comes into the temple, and once again, he cleanses the temple. It is this prophetic indictment on the temple system, the corruption of the temple. And Jesus is not alone. He's not the only person who thinks that the temple system under Caiaphas' leadership is corrupt. An entire community of people, known as the Essenes, have moved out of Jerusalem and out of the community of Israel in protest and as a way to form their own new community because of that response. So we have this dynamic in Jesus' ministry in these 3 years. They're bracketed by this response to what Caiaphas stands for in his position as the high priest. But this isn't the only threat that Jesus poses to Caiaphas. There's a more immediate threat as we get toward the end of Jesus' ministry. In John chapter 11, Jesus is just a few miles outside of town when he goes to a funeral. The funeral is that of Lazarus. And perhaps you know the story in John 11. Jesus attends the funeral. The 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, come out. Each of them ask the same question, Jesus, where were you? If you were here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus, in the midst of this conversation, he goes to the tomb and he weeps. He cries, but he knows what's about ready to happen. Why does Jesus cry? I think it's more than just Lazarus' death, but it is that. It's death itself that Jesus cries for. It's the loss, it's the grief of this moment. But Jesus has them roll the stone away, this preview of coming attractions. And Jesus cries out, Lazarus, come out, and Lazarus does. And the crowds there who had been mourning, you could imagine the paradigm shift as they realized what Jesus had said, I am the resurrection and life, that Jesus has that kind of authority. And so word begins to spread like wildfire in John 11. You can imagine to where we get to verse 45 in John 11. And it says, many of the Jews who had been there with Mary, and they saw what Jesus did, they believed him, and some of them went back to Jerusalem, and they told the Pharisees, and the Pharisees went and got the high priests, and they gathered in a council together. And so by the time we get to John 11, verse 48, the Pharisees and the high priests, they're all asking the question, what are we going to do? If we let him go on like this, everyone's going to believe in him. And then notice this statement in John 11, verse 48. And if we let that happen, then the Romans are going to come. And they're going to take away our place, and they're going to take away our nation. You see, one of the things that John is picking up on here in John 11 is he's picking up on this motivation, this drive they have for their own positions. Now, Caiaphas is not alone in that motivation. Jesus has pointed that out about other people. We see Jesus with 7 woes toward the Pharisees, and he says, woe to you, you do everything to be seen by others. You do everything because you love the places that you get at the feasts and the seats and the synagogues and the greetings in the marketplaces. You love the titles, rabbi or teacher, as people walk by you. You love your position. And Jesus says, woe to you. It's the opposite of the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who have nothing, because they know that in the kingdom, they can be given that which they don't have. Pilate even, in the trial, we'll talk about Pilate later, Pilate even understands the motivation of Caiaphas and the high priests and the officials who bring Jesus to him in trial early that morning. Pilate says this in Mark says this about Pilate in Mark chapter 15, verse 10. Even Pilate perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had Jesus delivered up. You see, I find this contrast intriguing as you look at Philippians. Because in Philippians 2, what we discover is Paul says, if you walk like Jesus, then you don't seek your own interests. Instead, you seek the interests of others. You do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, Philippians chapter 2. But instead, your mindset, your attitude, the way that you think is like Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be held onto or grasped, but he made himself nothing. Jesus let go of his position in order to come and die and redeem us. It's the exact opposite way of walking from what we see in Caiaphas and others like him in the gospel narratives. You see, Caiaphas would rather take this innocent man and have him crucified so that he could maintain his position with his power and his comforts and his wealth and all that is wrapped up inside of that. In fact, in John 11, after they're having this conference and they're saying, what are we going to do with him? The Romans are going to take away our position. It's Caiaphas who says this in John 11, verse 50. It's better that one man should die for all the people, not that the whole nation should die. And John points out with a wink, Caiaphas was prophesying. He didn't know he was prophesying, but he was actually prophesying exactly what Jesus would come and do. It is better. Caiaphas, in a way, was right. It is better that one man should die for all of the people. But the heart of Caiaphas was that he actually cared more about his position than he cared for the people. Jesus cared for the people more than he cared for his position. So it was that day that Caiaphas made that statement, that they made further plans to put Jesus to death, but they were afraid of the crowds. Why would they be afraid of the crowds? Well, because they were afraid of the Romans, and the crowds, just like Jesus, could put their position at risk. So they had to wait for the right opportunity, and a man named Judas, we've talked about him, comes and gives them that opportunity. And so the stage was set, and on Thursday night, Caiaphas dispatched a band of soldiers. Soldiers are coming into the Garden of Olives, and they come and they arrest Jesus and bring him back. And they bring him back to the palace of both Annas. First, they had to approach the Jewish high priest, but then Caiaphas. And Jesus stands before Caiaphas, and I find it intriguing, the charges that Caiaphas tries to develop to cause to stick to Jesus. One of them is the charge that you're the king. That's the charge they're going to take to Pilate in our next session. But the other charges are things like this. You refuse to pay taxes to Caesar. Well, Jesus had never refused to pay taxes. He merely said this: give to Caesar what is Caesar's. After all, the coins have his image on it, but give to God's what is God's. And I think Jesus is genius in this moment. After all, even Caesar bears the image of God. So Jesus didn't say don't pay taxes. And they said, well, you're going to destroy the temple. And Jesus didn't say that. He said eventually the temple is going to be judged. But that wasn't a public statement. That was to the disciples. What did Jesus say? You destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days. Jesus is talking about more than temple there. He's talking about himself. But they picked up on some of these, even the Old Testament language, these indictments of the temple, that God would come and the temple would be judged. But they can't make those charges stick. But the charge of blasphemy, Caiaphas asks, are you the Messiah? And Jesus responds, you've said it so. And he quotes Psalm 110. And I can't help but notice the irony here. As Jesus quotes Psalm 110, there is a line in this song that alludes to the priest in the lineage of Melchizedek. Now, that might be highly technical, but if you study the Old Testament, one of the things you recognize is that Caiaphas is in the lineage of Aaron. And Melchizedek, the lineage there, is somewhat mysterious. That's Jesus' lineage. If you look at the book of Hebrews, Jesus is standing there as the ultimate high priest with this high priest whose motivation is corrupt. He is the one, Jesus is the one who will sit in the very presence of God. Caiaphas can only enter into on the Day of Atonement, the presence of God, and what represents the presence of God once a year. Jesus, in many ways, is the greater high priest. And all these allegations that he levies against Jesus, ultimately, they are true. He is the Messiah. He is the King. He is the one who is going to sit at God's right hand. All of these allegations, the temple is going to be judged, and everything ultimately that bears the image of God will be given over to him. You see, Jesus stands before Caiaphas, and we find this contrast between the two of them intriguing. But we know, ultimately, Jesus is led from Caiaphas to Pilate. And Pilate, as we'll study in our next session, will ultimately declare Jesus not guilty, but will declare Jesus to be handed back over to be crucified. And as we see this contrast, we will see something happen at the death of Jesus that is kind of this last moment. Jesus' ministry bracketed with these statements, these indictments, but God has the final word. When we come to the cross of Jesus, when Jesus dies, the temple curtain, that 60-foot tall curtain, 30-foot wide, 4 inches thick, Josephus tells us. We are not sure which curtain it is, the inner or outer curtain, but this is a significant curtain, will be torn from top to bottom because Jesus is ultimately going to be the high priest who will give us access into the very presence of God. This very moment illegitimizes Caiaphas' position, the entire need for his position. Jesus is the high priest who gives us access into the throne room of God. And so in many ways, Caiaphas was right. It is better that one man die for all of the people so that they don't perish.